Next, I want to introduce James Moore. James is a postdoctoral researcher at the Humboldt Universität zu Berlin. He works on the Elephantine project with Verena Lepper and others there in Berlin. A colleague very interested in working on the early depending on your perspective, at least the Persian period Aramaic manuscripts. He's been working on the question of writer identification, script classification, and joining of fragments, especially unidentified fragments. Very exciting work, James. It's very nice to have you here, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So thank you for this. It's a privilege and an honor and a surprise to be asked to participate by you and your team. It's a great conference so far, and hopefully I can add a little bit to it from an Imperial Aramaic or a Persian period perspective. Today I want to talk about how we might move towards a systematic description of the Imperial Aramaic script, and then any implications this might have for your own data sets, Hellenistic or even Iron Age periods might be of interest to discuss. But I just want to dive right in, if I can, to the problems. Our problems begin with the data itself. That is, over the span of the Persian period, as well as throughout the Persian Empire, there are noticeable similarities between scribal conventions. This produces also noticeable similarities with the scripts that we see in these documents. So you can find very similar figures or scripts and formations in the late Bactrian texts and the earliest Elephantine texts, for instance. This causes immediately a problem with the data. The modern approach, at least in Imperial Aramaic studies, is based on Neve's old work, which says that the goal of paleography is almost solely to date texts. And that's where we stand for the most part in this particular subgenre of ancient studies. And so the critique that might be levied against this is that, as has been already heard today, the use of ad hoc classification systems is just not getting us anywhere. Everyone has their own system. The system's not clear to anyone else, and it becomes a bit of a problem. Related to what Mladen said earlier, we also have cherry picking, and something Michelle also brought up, in that the traditional paleographer only selects one or two letter types and brings them out for us and says, here's what the entire period of this script looks like based on these two letter types. We also don't normally seriously consider scribal techniques, tools, conventions, and what that may tell us about script formation. Related to this is something that Drew said earlier, that sometimes the social setting will play a role in script development, and as well as some others in the audience had discussed. So these are all recognized critiques. And then also Michelle brought up something that I also am quite passionate about, and that is, in the modern world, I see no reason why we should ever make a paleographic assessment based on a hand copy. So we have all of these critiques that we all are somewhat agreeing upon. And fundamentally, at least in my corpus and data set, the issue is, okay, we rely on subjective expert opinions of scholars who don't typically supply their data analysis. This then makes it quite difficult to critique the arguments. And then the arguments get elevated and reduplicated in scholarship. And the result is not just their historical misjudgments are made, but then they are perpetuated through the scholarly world by textual scholars, philologists, historians who pick up on them and use these as criteria. So as I'm trying to figure out how to work through this, obviously, I think we would all somewhat agree that at least if we need to rethink the goals of paleography to some degree. This conference is a great example of that. It's hard to imagine in the tales of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, someone talking about writer identification as an important part of paleography rather than solely dating the text. And this is a great step forward. But I think there's a lot more data mining that could happen and produce all sorts of other interesting observations. And I hope to maybe tantalize you with some of those today. This means, though, that we need to consider a whole spectrum of criteria: provenance, text type, orthography, error habits, material limitations, formatting expectations, as well as a variety of tools. And I just put on here the digital recognition that we're all talking about today. And so the unique thing about this particular presentation is that I would argue that we not just need conferences like this where we present our original work, but we also need to have meetings where we come up with real community standards that we can all agree upon on the most basic level, and also community recommendations and guidelines for organizing the sort of less empirical or more subjective data points, as well as for criteria that we all are engaged in, and that is photographing and things like that. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to run through a case study with you, and this is a document from Elephantini. It's a manumission contract written by a guy named Haggai. He doesn't give his last name, which is already a red flag in these contracts, where we normally know the writer's last name. The value of the data set of the Elephantini contracts is that they are, sorry, the sun's in my eyes. They are dated with precision, normally with 2 dates, an Egyptian and Babylonian date, so we can date it with precision. We have a list of witnesses who normally sign in their own hand, and we have the writer's name. So it's a great data set to begin with. Here you can see just graphically, you don't even need to know Aramaic to see the visual difference between what happens in the body of the contract written by the writer and the last lines, where the script drastically changes. And this is because the signatories at the end of the contract tend to sign with their own hand. If we pull these things out, we can see why there are some similar hands. Sometimes when we dig in a multifaceted approach and look at the pen nib profiles, we can start to see distinctions there. But generally speaking, we can identify multiple hands with multiple letter shapes coexisting all at one point in history on these manuscripts. So this becomes a nice little data set to mine for this kind of study. So my argument then is that we need to at least systematize this. One of the problems is I've gone through and I've tried to recreate Neve's observations given his own criteria. I've tried to recreate Lozach-Muir or Yardeni, though she unfortunately didn't write as detailed a study on the Elephantini texts. But I can never recreate them with their own methodology and with their own criteria, which I think is a bit of a problem. So we need to move away from expert opinion and develop community standards. I mean, after all, if the astronomers can tell us whether or not Pluto is a planet, I think we can tell the world what a stroke is. And that's not even a clear term. What is a stroke? Is it when the pen touches and leaves? Is it when it stops and changes direction? We need to agree on these terms and then move forward with those even most simplistic classifications, as long as they're clear. We also, I think, need to, at least I would argue that we need to define the difference between objective or empirical criteria, or at least quasi-empirical, that which we might agree upon, versus those categories that are much more subjective. And one of the problems then is that we have to sort of insist that we and all agree upon presenting our work so that it can be fairly critiqued. This would give us an opportunity to not just say the study is flawed because of methodological reasons, but here are the exact points that I would disagree on. At this letter and this word on this line, here's where based on our standard vocabulary and how we define these letters would be disagreeable. So I do this myself in my own just sort of data environment, which is within a relational database. So I already have the text there and I can easily create and dump them into a paleographic analysis and use the relational database to help control my own habits of exploring all sorts of possibilities by limiting the standard, the amount of options I have. And even on its most simplistic level, if we start analyzing every character, present them and their data, then we can come up with quite interesting data sets that we can mine for social historical observations. So for this case study, I just came up with the very simple terms. Okay, what is a vertical stroke, a horizontal stroke? What are the thresholds for these? In this case, a degree of 30 degrees is normally a threshold. And then ideally, we would fine tune these things in community standards. In Imperial Aramaic, many of the letters also have constituent parts. And here we are, here we have a horn, a crown, which is part of a horn, but it becomes a constituent unit, and then hooks, and then the reverse tilde. And generally speaking, any Aramaic letter or numeral from the Persian period can be made out of these strokes. Now, this may not be true for all of your data sets, but in the Imperial Aramaic items written with ink on papyrus, in good high quality IR photographs, we can see stroke patterns at the point of intersection. And this does result in very interesting data observations and what we might be able to conclude from these stroke patterns. So when we have that, it's a very valuable thing. And then there's occasional other things that I think we would all generally agree upon. Like we know what a tick is, according to sort of standard paleographical terms. And so an uptick at the end of a vertical or diagonal stroke, I think we would all agree if we had this criteria that that's what this is. And these basic starting points, I think older studies would consider this to be somewhat pedantic and unnecessary. But I mean, whenever we are now in a more advanced stage with better technology, making arguments based on, you know, a particular pixel, these kinds of more basic terms need to be defined clearly and used. So here's what I did, and this is just a quick view I created of some of the criteria that I would consider a bit more standardized or able to be duplicated by others to some degree of certainty. That is, we have an order of strokes. No Aramaic letter or numeral is normally made with more than 4 strokes, and that uptick category. And then simply, if we just go through and mark up our entire data set for every manuscript. The value of doing this in a relational database is that it's quite quick. I mean, you could do this whole text of 768 characters in just a few hours. And the truth is, this would be an easy web UI to develop, that once a community has standards, anyone can come and drop their text in and do it for themselves. And then there's also the facility, the value that relational databases can help with automation. Once you get 4 or 5 lines in and you know the writer and you know what's going on, as in the case of a contract like this, you can actually have the computer do most of it for you, and then your job is to edit. So there are also a ton of non-empirical or subjective criteria that are valuable, manuscript to manuscript, that must be accounted for. I actually, for every single stroke, I just mark it for stance. Like what Michelle said, we have with some writers, they write their pay at a certain point on the line as opposed to others. So I have a way of accounting for that. But this is very subjective, especially for my text, which the hanging line, mean line, and baseline are all imaginary. We don't have ruling lines like some of your scrolls do. And then I also mark other types of varia as they appear that are quite interesting. And all of that adds up to interesting statistical data. So for this manumission contract written by Haggai, we have 768 letters. And here's the distribution of the letters for that contract. Out of these, we actually only have about 59 distinct letter assessments or variations in total. And this is represented by 25 letters and numerals, 59 out of 25, with 25. And some of these variations are quite minute in terms of the architecture of the letter. So for instance, the aleph here, I have two distinct letter assessments, and that's because in 1 or 2 cases, the diagonal of the aleph has an uptick on it, and that's it. What is a bit surprising, and I found surprising, was that I had 7 different forms of nun, which the letter nun is almost never considered diagnostic in most studies. So if we go in and we look a bit more carefully about what's happening with the nun here with this writer, we see that all of them are made with 1 stroke. And that stroke constitutes some sort of head, either in a crown shape or in some cases a horn shape. And then there's also a long vertical or diagonal that's all part of that stroke. And again, because it's all quite easy to search through, these diagonals actually are related to the fact they're moving to a different letter or word quite quickly as opposed to slowly and things like that. This one that stands out as having two strokes, well, when we start to combine a multifaceted approach, considering the fact that there are many scribal errors in this manuscript, some of those errors and erasures and edits are due to slips of the eye, parablipsia. And there's also this issue that there's no last name, that you expect all writers to produce their last name. And this issue that the pen nib of the witnesses seems to match the pen nib of the body of the text, which is a bit of a surprise. Almost always a witness uses their own pen, or maybe a group of pens they're at the courthouse that they all use, I don't know. But it's a different pen than the writer. And then, yeah, so these kinds of issues start to add up to maybe what we're doing, what we see here is a copying error. So I think we would all, if we did this type of assessment, would agree on the data more or less, but we would all find this aberrant form. And then we can move into the world of interpretation once we all have a fair data assessment of what's going on. Other types of observations we can find from this type of presentation, just a couple of things that are worth pulling out here. So I mentioned this little uptick. This uptick is quite common for this writer at the end of long strokes. So the cough here, I have 86% of nearly 49 instances. 86% of them all have an uptick. You did this assessment, you may come up with 80% or 90%. In any case, I think that we could agree to move towards an interpretation that we have a distinct feature of cough for this particular writer, and we're starting to build a writer profile. And this is not based on intuition of an expert, but on just a clear assessment of the data that we can somewhat all agree upon. Conversely, it's a bit of a surprise that once you start to assess the data, you realize, okay, this writer builds characters from left to right, top to bottom. Though I think on Zoom, I have to go the other way because I'm reversed, but left to right, top to bottom. And so it's quite interesting then that the tav never has an uptick. Very interesting little feature of this writer, since so many tavs in these contracts have little upticks, or at least little feet. Again, if we had community standards, we could decide on what a foot is versus an uptick and things like that. But I think we'd all say that this is just the end of a straight line. And the reason for this might be quite clear that, okay, the writer is moving from left to right. So he writes his long stroke and then he picks his pen up, moving either straight up or to the right some. And it does not facilitate a leftward movement that would facilitate an uptick, as in the case with the cough, which always ends on the final stroke, the final long stroke, as with the pay and the nuns. So you can start to see writer elements of patterns in writing that then might actually help us distinguish between not just idiosyncrasies of a writer, but also perhaps educational trends. And this is where I'm most interested in paleography, is what can it tell us about educational traditions? So, for instance, in almost all writers of the Persian period, the crown formation is the head of all the Dalits and Ratias. Many of them writing on papyrus, though not necessarily on ostraca, will also use it for the baits. This writer, though, uses this sort of crown formation quite frequently for the mem and the nun. We would probably all agree on this if we actually laid out our data. Now, the interpretation we might disagree on, but I think that this is moving us in a direction of saying, hey, this is probably some sort of educational trend where this writer is taught that this constituent unit of this letter is put together with that one in order to build these other letters. When we combine this then with provenance, genre, and cultural features, such as maybe the ethnic prosopography analysis of the writer, as well as ethnonyms that the writer uses or comes in contact with, we might be able to start to talk about localized or regional educational traditions just by doing this kind of data mining. And the last example I want to give is here with this hay, which I found quite interesting. So the hay, as again, it's built left to right. So you have your crossbar top to bottom. So the high right, the high vertical here moving down, and then the lower vertical, since it's top to bottom, this would be last. What's fascinating is that the formation of the height is the only letter that's built, that's not built left to right in the same pattern. Well, that's an interesting observation that we can find with this kind of data analysis. It's supported by the fact that you have your crossbar and then your right vertical, and in many cases, the right vertical is turning, and we even have examples of upticks where the writer's pen is coming up now to write the left stroke last, which is unique to this writer only for this letter. So we would probably all agree on this data analysis, but what does it mean? Well, I would make an argument that this is probably also some sort of sign that the writer is conceiving of the height in the graphical pattern of the hay, and therefore he breaks the other sort of rules that he's been taught or uses. So these are the kinds of data mining observations that I think that we can make if we are just very clear about our data analysis and we use sort of technology and speed to present these in a clear and transparent way. So lastly, I think that this is a great, awesome conference, interesting debates so far, but it would be very nice to have something like this convened to make community standards that we can all just sort of agree upon. This will also help with publication of new ideas such as this, where it may disagree with certain old scholarly notions, and standards will help with that. It also helps us build believable writer profiles that we can also somewhat agree upon. And then we can make pretty good assumptions, I think, about educational trends based off of some of this once we have enough data accumulated. And then we can start to talk about the harder problem of dating. And I think dating is at least in my data set, as far as I understand the state of affairs, dating is the hardest and the last thing that we should be doing after we've collected enough data. And one last sort of difficulty is that we all publish typically in the humanities, and who is going to publish a file like this as an extra digital file in a journal? Not many journals will do this. So it also, community standards would sort of help us, I think, move towards a better presentation of our data and analysis. Okay, we'll see what you think. I don't know. Thanks.
Thank you so much, James. It's great to see your work and how things are going. We have a little bit of time. I want to give you a few extra minutes because we went a little long on the last one, just to make sure you get some questions. One thing that comes immediately to my mind about the issue of community standards and the quantification almost of qualitative data. That's a really tricky thing. And I'm sure it must have taken you a lot of time to produce this database. I'm not going to ask you how much time it took, but I'm sure it was a lot of work to have this sort of deep annotation, and I'm sure very helpful and fruitful, especially if you can get that level with a number of manuscripts for comparison. My question is, well, two questions. First of all, have you looked into similar kind of questions about community standards in other fields? I think that if you look, for instance, at medieval Latin paleography, this is something that's been tried extensively with large groups. And generally, the consensus is you're not going to ever convince everybody to use the same qualitative material. So that's something to engage with. And then also, I don't want to take up all your time, so But at what point does the workload for manually labeling things become too much, and then it's best to turn it over to automated systems?
As far as community standards in other fields, I do know they exist. I do know sometimes we have to be aware of the differences between scientific approaches and unscientific approaches. There's been, I was hoping to find some sort of solace in, for instance, forensic document examination. As I got into that in more detail, even though it has global standards, it became quite clear, especially from this really damning publication that the United States National Scientific Research Council produced, explaining how forensic document examination is not scientific. It became very clear that we need to at least make some sort of agreement, if possible, on what is a stroke, what is a vertical stroke, what is a diagonal stroke. And as long as we have those written down somewhere, you may disagree that I have diagonal stroke here, but you're not going to throw away the whole project because you don't like it, right? So it's a bit of a protection. As far as the other question goes, what was it? I forgot.
At what point does it become too labor intensive and you try to train a computer?
I don't know. I mean, I work in an SQL database every day. This took me a day to think about, half a day to produce, and then half a day to go through this document. I went ahead and went through all of the documents that have witnesses and did the witnesses, as well as the other names. But, and that by comparison, very interesting results. I don't have time to talk about them, but okay. Yeah, I don't know. It all depends on the fluency.
We can continue that conversation further. Judith had a comment that she wanted to make.
Yes, thank you very much. We could talk for ages about what strokes are and what crowns are and so on and so forth. And this is a fascinating subject for paleography. However, I would like to make a comment that it became a joke among Latin paleographers who spent years debating common terminology in the international forum of the Comité International de Paléographie.
Yep.
It doesn't make sense because every one of us has an approach. Of course, we try to make our work as scientific as possible. It has been the aim of Hebrew paleography since Malachi Betarieh and Colette Sirat, and even before them, Maurice Steinschneider. They wanted paleography to be scientific, and we all try to do it. However, the question of terminology, because actually you talk about the standards, but actually what you mean, it's not only you mean actually two things. One is terminology, and the other one is method. Every paleographer will have his or her own method of getting to a common aim, and it is extremely difficult to impose one common method to everyone. What I would like to tell you is that I don't follow the same terminology as you have just described, and my method is very different. However, I understand what you are saying, and I have no problem with following your thoughts, because indeed what we do is pretty logical and very visual, so it is quite easy to understand each other even if we don't speak the common language. And I would make an appeal as a medievalist, having spent 20 years teaching paleography and discussing the questions of terminology all over again and again, not to go into this subject, because it's not necessary. And actually, I think that it distracts us from interesting, dealing with what this stroke is and how it goes, what direction, how it changes, and for what reasons, that you have also, of course, presented very beautifully in your talk. But the question whether you call it a stroke, vertical, horizontal, and so on and so forth, is maybe not so important. A more important thing is the method itself.
I thank you so much for that comment. And yes, we could go around about this many hours. In short, I think one of the greatest problems is that we have experts like Neve, Lozac-Muir, and Cross, and they have presented us with good intuitive information. They've never taught us how to do it correctly because their system is so ad hoc and unhelpful. I think the only way for us to sort of move forward is to somewhat agree on a handful of most basic terms. Most, I'm not saying everything, I'm just saying the most basic terms for a given set of corpora at a time period, perhaps in a location, and then move forward from there. Whether or not the Dead Sea Scrolls scholars, the medievalists, or the Latin scholars will agree with this is with our classification is a different question.
James,
Yeah.
Peter.
Well, but you see, the terminology and classifications are not exactly the same thing. So this is what I say, that it could be, maybe it would be interesting to discuss the method as such and not the terms you are using. Because actually whether
But if you think about this from a database, classification 1 is just the number 1. Classification 2 is just the number 2.
Yeah, okay, fine. But actually your description is very clear, whether you use the same terminology or not. What could be discussed is your approach. For instance, baseline and headline. You have given a definition which is very different from the one that I'm using. And this could be discussed even if you use completely different terms. I think what the comment I'm trying to make is that there are two levels in what you are doing. One is the method itself. And that's extremely important to agree what we are dealing with and understand each other. Maybe not use the same method because it will never happen. But, and it's not, there is no point. I mean, we don't need to have one method. It's the plurality which is important. It's the possibility of exchanging and understanding that there are different methods.
I think the important thing is that we can critique each other's method fairly. And that's all I want, is a system in which we can come together and say, I want you to disagree with me. I want you to show me where I'm wrong, because I'm sure I'm wrong. But
maybe you are not. The point is what I'm saying, that maybe you are not. Maybe using different ways. Look, what we do is we simply look at manuscripts. These were written by humans, and we are humans looking at them, right? It will be always subjective. We try to be as objective and scientific as we can, but actually the beauty of the interpretation of the manuscript is how we look at them. And each one of us will look at them differently. The computer will not, maybe, although there are already about 100,000 methods of computer description of the manuscript. So it will be the same problem as the human description of the manuscript. But what we do, we look at it. So what I'm trying to say is that every way of looking at the manuscript can be interesting. It doesn't mean that if people follow a different method, that they are wrong. What I try to say that instead of imposing one method, it's just to discuss and try to understand what other people do, because it might actually be more interesting than we, all of us, trying to speak in the same language.
Judith?
When we look at the manuscript, we don't
Judith, I think
same thing.
Thank you so much for the contribution. Unfortunately, we've been going a little bit over time, so I hope you can pick this up a little bit. We don't have any more time to do more questions, but Peter Stokes also had some comments and some positive notes he wanted to give to you. So I don't know, perhaps you have a chance to interact later.